On Sunday evenings, we've been looking through the life of David. And last week, we looked at the final conversation that took place between David and King Saul. David had spared Saul's life. And he asked the king, why did he hunt for him all the time when he'd given him every proof that he wasn't trying to take his throne? He reminded Saul that God would make him pay dearly if he shed his blood. And Saul replied that he was sorry for his behaviour and promised that he wouldn't try and kill him anymore. In fact, David could come back to the royal court if he wanted to. But David wasn't having any of that. Instead, he called upon God to let righteousness prevail and to look after him. David and Saul then went their separate ways. And to begin with, David felt quite happy at the way things had turned out. But chapter 27 of 1 Samuel opens up by telling us that a little time later, David had a big down. This is true about most Christians at some time in their life, they have a big down. And David became very depressed, and he said to himself, one day I will perish by the hands of Saul. So despite God's assurance that one day he would be the king, he now seems to have got the idea that that was never going to happen because Saul would murder him. David had written many psalms about trusting in God, but his faith gave way, and so doubts began to rise in his mind. And this confirms that important statement that he himself wrote in the Psalms, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Man is only a creature that God has made, and of himself is nothing. And David's own life proves that. So here's David, thought to be one of the best people in the Bible, but he's really down and not trusting in the Lord. Apart from our Lord, and perhaps Moses, David has more said about him in the Bible than anybody else. Why do you think that is? It's probably because he was a man after God's own heart. But we've already seen up till now how quickly he could change from good to bad and from rejoicing to depression. And all his faults and mistakes and depression and sins are faithfully recorded down in the Bible so that we might learn never to glory in man. No doubt one of the main reasons why David had given way to depression was because he got one setback after another. Everybody gets setbacks, and then you have a bit of a breather of good times, and then another setback. He seemed to get one setback after another. He hadn't had to endure only one trial, but many coming again and again. If you remember, he'd gone to the help of the people of Keilah, but they tried to betray him to Saul. He'd gone to help the Ziphites, and the people there betrayed him to Saul. He'd even gone to the tabernacle, and there that evil man Doeg had planned his harm. He'd spared the life of the king, yet he still came after him. And added to this was the fact that his first wife had been taken away from him. So it seemed to David that wherever he went and whatever he did, he came unstuck. It was a bit like Joseph. God had planned great things for him. He would be the ruler of Egypt. And yet in the early part of his life, he had nothing but trouble with one setback coming after another. And God was going to make David the king, but not until he suffered all these different setbacks. At this particular time, he was left out in the wilderness, living as an outlaw with his men. And he was getting fed up with it and wondered why things couldn't go right for him as it did for others. But perhaps this was just a twinge of self-pity. For he had tried to serve God, but everything had gone wrong for him, whereas Saul, who'd gone against God, lived in a palace. It was a bit like John the Baptist in the New Testament. He had served the Lord extremely well, and yet finished up in a prison, whereas Herod the king was an adulterer, and he lived in a palace. So it's not surprising that John momentarily felt depressed. And it's not surprising that Christians can feel the same way today and sink so low as to feel that there's no profit in serving God. But how sinful it is to treat God like that. Now, previously, whenever David had made any decisions about his future plans, he prayed. He was a great man of prayer. We see that in his Psalms. But there's no account here of him praying. He's getting depressed, but he's not praying. He doesn't seek God for directions as to what to do. And so he goes by his own depressed common sense. Well, when people do that, they start seeing their problems as bigger than they are and see their God as smaller than he is. The Christian must learn the precious lesson that they must always turn their discouragements into prayer. Don't keep your unhappiness and doubts in your heart. Bring them to God in prayer. David's words here about him perishing are very similar to what the disciples said in the boat. Master, carest thou not that we perish? And both outbursts came from unbelief and a feeling that God wasn't aware of their trouble. And it's then more than ever that we should seek the Lord in prayer and tell him how we feel. But David doesn't do that. Instead, he decides to leave Israel and go to the land of the Philistines. But again, notice his words. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. In other words, this is the best I can do regarding the terrible situation I'm in. But what despair to think that joining the enemies of God's people is the best thing you can do. How foolish it seems to be. But have there not been Christians who felt the same way? They've been so low at times that they thought there was nothing better for them than to leave the church and to join up with ungodly people in the world. How could David hope for good treatment from the Philistines when he'd only just escaped with his life the last time he was amongst them, and then it was by trying to make out he was mad, do you remember? But he makes up his mind to go, and he takes his 600 men with him and goes to Achash, the king of the Philistines. Back in the 22nd chapter, the prophet Gad had told David that God wanted him to be in Judah and to stay in Judah. But now he's leaving Judah, so he's going against God's revealed will. And this was not only wrong, it was stupid, because he'd done the self-same thing before and lost out by it. You know, there's an old saying, isn't there, that a child that's been burned will never go near a fire again. But David was doing just that. It's possible for a Christian to have lost out in the past by mixing with the ungodly, yet at a later stage they can go and do the same thing again. A Christian can also go back to the same sins that once caused them trouble, even though they said at the time, I'll never get involved with that again. God had more than once used David against the Philistines. He'd slain their champion Goliath, but now he's actually joining them. See, David's one great desire was to get away from Saul so that he wouldn't come after him anymore. But he was specifically going against God's word in order to do that. I would imagine that most of us tonight know that lovely verse in the book of Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him and he shall direct thy paths. But instead of doing that, David was leaning to his own understanding. He'd not prayed about it, so he hadn't got God in his eyes. He hasn't got God in his circumstances, so God would not direct his paths. Instead, he went his own way. Now, verse 3 says that David lived with King Achash. He and his wives and his men settled down amongst the Philistines, and surprisingly, they were treated well. The king was obviously pleased to see David. He probably felt that he would be an asset now that he was so much hated by Saul, and seems as though he felt that David might even join with him in fighting Saul. So David seemed to have gained by leaving the place of God's choice, and things went well for him for a while. And so it is sometimes for Christians today that when they go out of God's will, things can go well for them for a time, and they don't feel they've lost out by it. But was it not the case with the prodigal son? That when he left his father, he didn't go straight to the pigsty. First of all, things went very well for him as he devoured his father's money. Now, those who know of this, the outcome of this event here in the book of Samuel, will be reminded by the word Ziklag in verse 6 of what happened to David later on. how the Amalekites came and took his wives and children away and burnt down his home, and his men spoke about stoning him to death. See, God's ways are always best in the end. And if somebody forsakes his will, no matter how much they might seem to gain by it at the time, they can't gain finally. And yet verse says here that when Saul heard that David had gone over to the Philistines, he decided to give up trying to get him. He probably hoped that the Philistines would kill him eventually. Notice an important truth here, for Saul had already promised not to go after David, but it wasn't that which stopped him going after him. It wasn't the fact that he promised. It was the fact that he could no longer reach him. And so it is with a lot of people who can no longer commit a certain sin. It's not because they've repented over it and they're determined not to sin like that again. It's because their circumstances won't let them do it again. Perhaps a man is working in an office and he's been pilfering from the petty cash, and he's done it for a long time and he seems to have got away with it. But then he's moved from that position to another part of the office and he can no longer pilfer from the petty cash tin, so he doesn't commit that crime anymore. But it's not because he doesn't want to. The fact is, in many cases, it's not the person who leaves the sin, it's the sin who leaves the person. They would gladly have carried on with it if they could have done, but they were stopped. See, what God is looking for is not just the end of somebody's sin, but also for a change of heart which would make that person not commit that sin anymore, even if they had the opportunity to do so. In verse 5, David asked the king of the Philistines, would it be possible for he and his men to be given a town away from the royal city so they could all live there? He realised that if he stayed in Gath, the capital city, leading Philistine men might start to get jealous of him and be annoyed with him. He may also have felt it was very difficult for him and his men to seek the Lord in the centre of the Philistines, in the main city, and no doubt idolatry was there. And he possibly felt that he could exercise his faith more easily in a town of his own. He doesn't ask for any particular town to live in, just any town that Achash would choose, for beggars can't be choosers. And he's very polite when he asks for it. He says, if I found grace in thy sight. But it's rather sad to see him call himself the servant of Achish. Fancy the Lord's anointed descending to such a level as seeing himself as a servant of an ungodly king. But such is often the case when a backslidden Christian not only goes into the world and mixes with the ungodly, but eventually become servants to the ungodly and start doing what they tell them to do. This is what happened to the prodigal son. He became a servant to the pig farmer who gave him a real bad time of it. But how stupid David had become, where he was going to let an ungodly Philistine choose the town that he should live in. Verse 6 tells us that the king gave David the town of Ziklag to live in, which in one sense was rather kind, for Ziklag already belonged to Israel, really. It fell to the tribe of Judah in Joshua's day. The lot fell to Judah. And it only became a Philistine town after they had forcibly taken it. But from now on it would always be owned by David and his descendants. Ziklag was on the border between the land of the Philistines and the land of Israel. It was a good place for David to be in from a point of view of being able to keep his eye on what was going on in Israel and recruiting more Israelites to his cause. But as we've seen, it was not going to be the best place for him personally, and certainly not regarding his soul. Now, verse 7 tells us that David lived amongst the Philistines for 1 year and 4 months. No doubt he missed his homeland during that time, and above all, he'd missed the house of God. His Psalms tell us how much he missed going to God's house, and he longed for the day when he would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Perhaps now he was in Ziklag, he began to think about things more and gradually turning back to God, and he was learning the ways of God. His faith was gradually coming back, and therefore the promises of God meant more to him, especially the promise about him becoming the king. He would certainly not forget that the Israelites were God's people, and the Philistines were not. So he couldn't have been very happy to stay there all that time. The question was, what was he going to do with himself during that time? And he decided to take his men and go out and attack various groups of people who lived in the lands round about. These were the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. They were all heathen people, and they'd been marked out for destruction in the days of Joshua. David may also have felt that he was serving the nation of Israel by fighting against these people, and of course he was also at the same time bringing in provisions for his own men to live off. He was also training his men in action for the days ahead when they would form part of Israel's army under his command. But it's also possible that David was doing this in order to calm his own conscience because he'd forsaken Judah where God had told him to be. Perhaps he thought that if he did some great exploits, this would make up for it. At this time, David was a backslider. He drifted away from God. And there are backsliders today who feel that if they did something particularly good, this would make up for their disobedience. But as the hymn says, could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. If the Christian is doing wrong and not doing their Christian duty, nothing good they do instead can make up for it. Now David had complete success in his attacks upon these people. He killed them all and took their possessions away. But sadly, when he returned and Achish asked him where he'd been, he told a big lie. All we seem to be telling lies. He said that he'd attacked the southern part of Judah and various other places in Israel, which he'd not, but it sounded better. Verse 11 says that the reason why he'd slain all the men and women was so that nobody would be alive to report what had actually happened. David reckoned that if the Philistines had have known where he really had been, they would have realised that David was still on Israel's side and would therefore have seen him as their enemy. And so he lied and said that he attacked the Jews. And this gave Achish the idea that he would always be attacking Israel from now on. And he felt that this would make the Jews have a greater hatred for David. It was a clever trick, but such deception against people who've been treating you well doesn't seem to be right. And it shows again that at this time he wasn't walking closely with God. When later on his possessions and his people were taken away, he must have seen the reaping for what he'd sown, because it was the Amalekites who he had attacked and another group of Amalekites who came and attacked him. And so we see David at this time doing a mixture of good things and bad things, and apparently gaining success by it. And there are people today who've got a strong belief in God, and yet at the same time they're involved with underhanded and sinful pursuits. And sometimes they seem to profit by it. The one obvious lesson that comes out of this scripture is that you cannot measure the rights and wrongs of a certain course of action simply by whether it brings success or not. You see, what concerns most people today is not about what's right and wrong. It's what they believe is best for themselves. A lot of modern churches work on this principle, that numerical success is the main thing, even if it's obtained by offering people that which they will enjoy, as opposed to them receiving the truth from the preaching of God's word. They actually believe that the increase in number shows that God must be pleased in what they're doing. Well, anyway, after a while, the Philistines decided to launch another attack on Israel. This had been going on all the years when Saul had been king. But previous to that, in the days of Samuel's leadership, the Philistines had never attacked once. But the people had rejected Samuel in favour of a king, and the result was constant warfare. Had Saul been a man of God, he would have been able to subdue the Philistines by now, but his departure from God meant that they were a constant threat to him. And so chapter 28 opens up by Achish telling David that he must go with the Philistines against Israel, thinking that David would welcome the opportunity to get his own back on Saul and possibly take over from him as the new king, and then join the Israelites to the Philistines. This put David in a very difficult position. He certainly didn't want to fight against the Israelites. They were his own people. But neither did he want to say no to this king. And so in verse 2, he gives him rather an uncertain reply. What he's saying is this: I'm sure that we will do the right thing when it comes to it. By saying this, he kept himself from making a promise, and yet at the same time left Achish expecting that he would help him. And again, Achish was taken in by this. For he says to David, I will make you the keeper of my head forever. In other words, he would make David captain of his guard, the one who would protect him as his bodyguard. David's difficult position had come about because of the lies that he told, when he said he'd been fighting against some of the people of Israel, giving the king the impression that he would help the Philistines fighting against Israel. But then telling lies does often lead to people putting themselves in a jam, for God makes sure that people don't gain through their dishonesty. But notice another warning here, for David had sought favours from ungodly people and received them. But perhaps without realising it, this put David in debt to those people, so that when later on they come asking him to do them a favour, it became very difficult for him to say no. And that's what can happen today. If a Christian accepts favours from unbelievers, or if they're happy to accept gifts from unbelievers, what's going to happen later on if those same unbelievers ask the Christian to do favours for them, especially if the favour is to do with something underhanded and not strictly honest or true? That Christian might find themselves in an awkward position, either to do that which they feel is wrong, or to refuse to do it, in which case it looks like ingratitude. So we all ought to think twice before accepting favours from people who don't love God. Now, verse 3 reminds us that Samuel was now dead. This is strange, really, because we've already been told that before. But it's stating it again so as to show us the reason why the Philistines decided to attack the Israelites now. They probably felt that with Samuel out of the way, they would probably not have to face the God of Israel, and therefore they would win easily. You see, a country's best defence is not in its armaments, it's in the people of God who pray for it. And when they're taken away, the nation becomes weak. No wonder there was so much lamentation over Samuel's death. We're told here that Saul had put away the wizards and those with familiar spirits. He put them out of the land, he banned them from being there. That was the law which God had given to Moses. But Saul probably had only done this now because he was scared of the thought of the Philistines attacking him, and he wanted to do something which would please God so as to get the Lord to help him. Or it's because Saul himself had been troubled for a long time with evil spirits, and now he realised this, and he got annoyed with those who dabbled in such things. And so he decided to ban them from his kingdom. But this is only mentioned here at the end of verse 3 because of what follows in this chapter about the witch of Endor, who we will look at next time, God willing. But what we do see here is that when a nation goes away from God, we must expect to see more people dabbling in the spirit world. Anyway, everything was now being prepared for one great battle. The battle which would eventually lead to the death of Saul. The question was, what part would David play in this battle? Previously to this, his fear that was in him had led to disobedience. His disobedience had led to going out of God's will. His going out of God's will led him to telling lies, and his telling lies led him into a position of danger. Later in Psalm 119, David was to write, "Remove from me the way of lying," which rather suggests that this had become his besetting sin. We've seen him telling lies many times, even to the high priest. You see, the way of lying implies an habitual sinning in this way. The person who gives into any particular sin may eventually find themselves in the way of that sin. We live in such a dishonest society today where many people are telling lies on every hand, and a great deal of what you hear in the media is not true. And so it's becoming very difficult to always tell the truth yourself. Does that concern you? If we want to be honest instead of deceitful, we must often pray this prayer, Lord, remove from me the way of lying. Don't let me say anything that's not true. But we have found that the more we read about David's failings, so the more we see how we need the blood of Christ to cleanse us from our sin. Because sin and failure is in us as well. So may God help us to live good, honest lives throughout the remainder of our days and keep us from the sin which can so easily beset us. Amen.